Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to show you my round 3 game from the Vrsar Open, and I was facing an opponent who plays the London system all the time. So for the first time in a long while, I did a lot of prep against the London for that round, because round 2 was played in the morning the day before, and I had a relatively short game, 13 moves. I had a whole day to prepare. So I ended up going through many lines against the London system until I found something very interesting. So I'm going to show you a setup that gives you an advantage against the London in case they play e3, c3, knight f3 and bishop f4. So let's go d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6. Now my opponent sometimes starts with bishop f4, sometimes he plays knight f3. And against knight f3 I've chosen a line that either forces a small advantage to black, if they play that stuff with queen b3, queen c2, queen c1, or we get the position I got in the game, or we go into a crazy line where white's down a pawn. So here bishop f4 and now c5. Okay, e3, the main line move, knight c6, and here the correct move is knight bd2. Now, I have played c3 myself on several occasions because I quite enjoy those technically bad positions for white after queen b6, queen b3, c4, and so on. But my opponent almost always plays c3, so I was expecting that. I played queen b6, which is the main move, and now if queen b3 is played, then we get the usual bad position for white, c4, queen c2, bishop f5, the bishop cannot be taken because the rook's hanging, and d5 is defended, queen c1, e6, and we just have a dominant bishop and the better queen and pressure on b2 and an advanced pawn on c4. Black's better. But my opponent does not play queen b3 in this position, he plays queen c2, and he has played it before. There's one game of his in the database which he lost against a FIDE master. So I've prepared something very, very tricky for white to play against. g6. Okay, so the idea is, in some cases, bishop f5, depending on what white does, but the idea is also knight h5, harassing this bishop. So when he played knight bd2, the most common move is bishop g7 here, followed by bishop f5, but I had prepared knight h5. This has only been played 2 or 3 times before. And bishop g5 is bad, bishop g3 is bad, bishop e5 is the best move. He played that. And still my prep, f6, the bishop must retreat to g3. The idea behind knight h5 and f6 is to prepare a quick e5. Okay, in this position I took on d4, because, and this is still my prep, because when I take on d4, if c takes d4, there's e5 immediately. And after d5, knight g3, hg3, fe5, black has these 2 central pawns and the bishop pair, and the position is wide open, and it's not at all clear where the white king should go. If, for example, castle's queenside, then a simple idea like bishop f5 followed by rook c8 could be crushing. So my opponent took with the e-pawn, which I had expected, but this now makes e5 strong in a different way. If I manage to play e5, that means that, I'll have pressure towards the white king down the e-file. Okay, bishop f5 first, chasing the queen away, queen b3. And now I just have a very pleasant endgame ahead of me, and this position was still, my preparation. I was expecting this. So queen b3, a b3, knight g3, hg3, and bishop g7. And the idea is simple. I'm going to go e5 and just overwhelm white. This is, according to the engine, close to equal. My opponent played perfectly, but from here he started making mistakes. So he played knight h4, which is a very bad move. The engine switches, gives a small advantage to black, but from a human perspective it's even worse, because the knight's no longer defending e5, and if e4 comes, the knight has no squares to retreat to, because g5 wins the knight. So I played bishop d7, and here my opponent had gone badly wrong with f4. Now I have a big advantage. I can play e5 straight away, but I had decided to castle first, because castling is fine. knight hf3 and e5. Okay, so how would you react with white? My opponent played the losing move here, and you simply cannot take on e5. So the engine plays bishop b5, e d4, bishop c6, b c6, knight d4, c5, something like that. But my opponent decided to take, and according to the engine, now it's game over. For humans, not so simple yet. fe5, knight e5, and knight d4 was played. Believe it or not, this position is -4. Now I knew that I was winning because the white king is, you know, in the middle of nowhere, and I'm threatening rook a8 and I'm threatening knight g4. I just couldn't decide which move was better. Knight g4 wins material, and I ended up playing that. Rook a8 wins the game. Unfortunately for me, I had misassessed it. If rook a8, white has nothing better but to run away with the king, basically, because, you know, if you make a random move, let's find the random move, for example, knight df3, for example, the knight f3 wins the knight. If you play, let's say, rook h2, the knight f3 check, if king f2, then bishop d4 wins the game. If king d1, then rook e1 wins the game, and the rook's hanging. So on rook a8, white probably castles, and now on knight g4, there's no defense to rook f2. I don't know. Also, I'm threatening bishop d4, followed by bishop f5 and rook c8. So let's say they try, if they don't save the rook, just knight f2. If they save the rook, for example, then bishop takes d4, cd4, and bishop f5, and white's getting mated. That's the end of the game. I mean, probably there's a way to give away some pieces. The engine plays bishop c4. Okay, instead, I played a line that's still winning according to the engine, just not immediately over. I played knight g4. And now my opponent played knight to f3. If he doesn't, then I'm gonna go rook a8 followed by knight f2 and win the exchange. So knight 2 to f3, rook a8 check, and this is how I win material. King d2, of course king d1 loses to knight f2, and now knight f2, and I'm gonna play knight e4 check, win the pawn on g3. That's what happened. And in this position I could have gone bishop d4 first. That was more winning. That's another thing I didn't see. If I go bishop d4, the knight cannot take. If the knight takes, then of course I go rook f2 check, and that's it. Something like bishop e2 fails to knight g3 and the bishop hangs. If on bishop d4 cd4, then it's even simpler, bishop f5, and the king has no good retreat squares. Let's say king c1 running away from the checks, just rook c8, king d1 and knight g3, and that's about it. The bishop hangs, c2 is weak. That's the end of the game. But I just took on g3 because I had intended to do so before I played knight g4. It's still fine, it's still a massive advantage for black, also a material advantage now. Bishop d3 played, and here once again I had a very strong idea with bishop d4, a move I'd completely misassessed. I saw it, but I didn't really like it. If knight d4, then rook f2 check. And what do? If king b1, then rook e1 check. You have to go to a2. I take on a1, and I play something like king g7. This rook is offside, the pawn is pinned, I'm just going to queen my two pawns. The engine says -5. But on bishop d3 I had decided to save my a-pawn. And, you know, I saw the line that went a6, rook a5, knight f5. And that seemed winning to me. It is winning, it's worse than bishop d4. Rook a5, knight a5. Now you cannot, knight f5, you cannot take on d5 obviously because of knight e3 check. So you better eliminate that knight first. But there are tricks when you do, because my rook's gonna infiltrate on e2. So my opponent takes, I took with the bishop. And now if you take again on f5, I take with the rook, just defending my d-pawn. So you have to take now. But I'm infiltrating, rook e2 check. And of course, if, you know, king d1, then I take on d3, take on b2. If king c1, well, I guess that's playable, but it's definitely doesn't seem as good. So my opponent played king b1, which I agree with. And now, simply bishop d3, rook d3, and this position is almost black to play and win. I did not see the best move. The best move is rook f2, which just ties down this rook and this one. So if this rook moves, I take on f3 with the f8 rook. I don't really know what to suggest here. If the knight moves, then I have ideas like rook f1, and this is a big advantage for black. I played rook f5, which drops my advantage to literally 0. So I went from -5 to 0 within 10-15 moves. Okay, my opponent must do something. Rook d2 is the best move, they have to trade. No, rook d2 is actually a big mistake. He should have gone g4, misplacing my rook first. Okay, and then after g4, rook h2, knight h2, rook f2, it should be equal. But rook d2 loses, excuse me. So the reason it loses is because I will have bishop e5 targeting the rook and the pawn will be undefended by force. However, once I take on d2 and the knight takes on d2, I play rook f2, preparing bishop e5, winning the game, but my opponent plays knight e4 with tempo. And now, the rook is not an issue, because I have rook e2, of course, but they play knight c5. And now this means that we trade the g2 pawn for the b7 pawn, perhaps even for the b7 and the a6 pawn. And I had completely misjudged this position. So what I did was rook e7, which is an awful move. Once again, the engine says black's winning here, and of course the move is bishop e5. And I was so upset during the game for having missed this opportunity, because I saw the potential it had. I just didn't see that rook e7 allows my opponent to untangle. So let's look at bishop e5 briefly. Let's assume that they save the rook, either rook h1 or rook h3. Let's say rook h1. I take on g2, they take on b7, and I push h5. And that's over. I mean, I'm just queening my pawns. I don't know, say knight c5. I can let go of this pawn. Bishop g3 takes, h4, b4, g5. White's nowhere near fast enough. b5, g4, I don't know, b6, h3. And I'm just queening. I'm just playing h2, rook g1 check. In any case, bishop e5 would have been a relatively simple win. I think even I couldn't mess up. But I played rook e7. Now it's equal again. So g4, getting rid of the weakness, of course. Bishop f8, a nonsensical move. I wanted to play rook e1 check, but of course that can be defended. I just wanted the knight to move. My opponent moved the king away from the check. Rook f7, knight e4, bishop e7, rook f2, and rook f2 is, according to the engine, a mistake, because I can have an outside passed pawn a few tempi quicker and on the h file. So my opponent's going to be left with the knight against my bishop, so I took. And here I played king f7. I should have gone h5 straight away, although I did play it a bit later, so I still got that same type of winning position. I played king g5 here, which is bad. I should have gone h5, and now they take. And an outside passed pawn defended by the bishop means that the king or the knight are going to be tied down. And an important nuance compared to the position we're going to have in the game is that I didn't have a pawn on the h file. I had a pawn somewhere else. And the knights are way more efficient against pawns that aren't on the edge of the board. So here, for example, king f3, h4, I don't know, b4, king e5, knight d3 check, king d5. This is a very nice position for black, because once again the king is tied down to these squares, or these, to defend against the pawn. When instead I played king g5 because, moving your king up the board makes sense. Also, I'm threatening to play bishop c5. So my opponent played king f3 defending the pawn, king h4, b4, h5. Okay, so in this position, I took with the g-pawn. And the reason I took with the g-pawn, I took with the king. The reason I took with the king is because I need more flexibility for my king. If I take with the pawn, then a simple move like knight e4 could completely restrain my king. So I took with the king. Now I have a g-pawn, not an h-pawn. It's not as simple. Okay, so knight e4, g5, I need to bring my king into the game. Of course, this is a dead even endgame, but I'm playing for the win because I have an outside passed pawn. It can be controlled easily because it's not on the rook file, but still. Furthermore, my opponent's pawns are all on dark squares, so I may have some chances there. So I probed the pawns, wanted to get my king closer. b5 was a very nice move, trading pawns, because there's knight c7 check. And of course, if my opponent just recaptures with the pawn, then they are losing, because I can do whatever I want. Now my king is infiltrating. But knight c7 saves white. And at this point I knew it was a draw. I just still had to try to win because I'm better. So knight d4, king b4. I want to misplace the knight and take on b3, so king d5. Knight e6, I have to save my pawn. King e4, g3. And now, of course, something like king f4 loses to g2, so king f3 is forced. Bishop e5, I have to defend my pawn. Now, finally, the b3 pawn is hanging. He played king g2. But if I take on b3 now, then knight c5 wins the b7 pawn, so I have to play b6 first. And now there are a number of ways for my opponent to draw. One of them is simply knight f8. If knight f8, knight d7, I still cannot easily take that pawn. But I took on b3 here, and now if my opponent isn't careful, if I'm given one more move, I could be winning. The only two moves are knight f8 and c5. If my opponent doesn't play one of those two moves, I'm completely winning, because they sort of have to defend the pawn. c5 is the easiest draw. If I take, then my opponent just takes, and here knight c5, and my king moves somewhere, and then knight e4 picks up the pawn, and it's a draw. So I played b5 because at least this way I'll have two pawns against the knight, which still gives me winning chances. And a funny story here. So about a month before the tournament, I was studying the exact endgame we're gonna get. So I sacrifice a piece, of course. King c4, I want to restrain the knight. Takes. Okay, b4. Let's pretend that this king is somewhere here and that the pawn doesn't exist. It's the same endgame. It doesn't really matter whether the king is on h8 with no pawns. The point is the king cannot prevent the pawn from queening, in this case because I queen, in the case where the king is on h8 because the king is too far away. There is only one way for white to draw. Now my opponent is a very experienced player. He played it instantly, and I knew what he had to do. I knew what the correct move was, because I had been studying this endgame. When he played it, I wanted to cry. And after the game, he told the arbiter, "Oh, I know knight endgames." Congratulations to him. This was really, really nice technique. So let's say you make a random move. I don't know, knight e6. Or let's say you take the pawn. I'm just queening. There is, I'm just going to queen. b3, and you're never stopping the pawn. So the only way to stop the pawn is to deliver a check. How? You prepare it with knight e8. And now I'm simply not quick enough. b3, knight d6 check, king b4. It doesn't really matter what I play. Knight e4, and now the point is that the knight is going to be controlling the pawn from d2. So for example, I played b2, my opponent played knight d2, I played king c3, and this is a dead draw. As soon as the knight reaches the square in front of the pawn on the 7th rank on a knight file, it's a draw. This is a well-known trick. So all you have to do from the starting position is calculate your way to b1. So the game ended like this. And here we agreed to a draw. If in this position I play king d5 instead of b3, then it's still the same thing, just the other way around. Knight c7 check, king c6, knight a6, b3, knight b4 check, king b5, and knight d3. And after something like king c4, knight b2 check, it's the same thing, it's just, you know, not on the 7th rank. So let's say king c3, knight a4. The point is I can never push my pawn because my opponent takes it. So the game was a draw. And knowing that you're crushing your opponent and then not winning is devastating. And unfortunately, this was a double round day. So, you know, going into the afternoon round after this is not easy. But still, my prep against the London system has never been more successful. I think I absolutely destroyed him with this idea. So if your opponent plays c3 with queen c2 against queen b6, this is a very strong weapon against the London. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.